Welcome to the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park. And also not that too. My name's Ryan Rogers and I'm a big dumb Jurassic Park fan. Welcome to episode 67, The Encased Mosquito, recorded on June 26th, 2024. Thanks for joining me today. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E, and you can check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today's intro is Sally Ride from Snail's second album Charlemagne, and the outro is Late Bloomer from the self-titled album Snail. Alright, and corrections today. In the last episode I called X Twitter by force of habit. That's a penny in the jar. I'm sorry to Elon. Also, I misspelled and mispronounced, also known as I got incorrect, the name of the screenwriter for the first draft of the script. It's not Maria Scotch Marmo. It's Malia Scotch Marmo. Geez, where could I have gotten the incorrect spelling of her name from? Oh wait, hang on. It's on the cover page of the frickin' hard copy of the script I'm physically holding. Like, this thing has some noticeable but ultimately forgivable typos in it, but her name isn't typed correctly. Give me a break, right? Malia reportedly teaches or has taught screenwriting at the Columbia University Graduate School of Arts, Sarah Lawrence College, and La Famille in Paris, and has had her hand in penning scripts or drafts of scripts you may be familiar with, including Spielberg's 1991 film Hook and Robert Zemeckis' 2004 film Polar Express. But I'm astonished that her name is misspelled on the cover page of this script. That's just not right. But nonetheless, Malia, I will not misspeak your name again. And lastly, in episodes 21 and 22, the tour parts 1 and 2, I think I repeat myself quite a bit during the exposition section. Like, over and over. The scripts for those episodes were huge, because that chapter was also huge, hence why I broke it into 3 episodes, and obviously I got confused and repetitive. My apologies for wasting everyone's time during that point. Alright, dinosaur news. Let's talk about 2 new dinosaurs. The first news story is Diukin lechiguane, a new unenlagine from the Bajo de la Carpa formation of Neuquén Province, Patagonia, Argentina, in an article published June 14th, 2024 in the journal BMC Ecology and Evolution. Almost none of those words in that title are fun to say out loud. Alright, here goes. This new dromaeosaur is Diukin lechiguane, and it was found in the Santonian rocks of Argentina. The authors say, quote, although known only from a very incomplete postcranial skeleton, the preserved bones of Diukin differ from corresponding elements in other unenlagians, justifying the erection of the new taxon. Moreover, in several morphological aspects, the humerus of Diukin appears intermediate between those of the geologically older unenlagines from the Neuquén Basin, like Unenlagia from the Turonian Coniacian Puertozuelo formation, and that of the stratigraphically younger, larger-bodied Austroraptor cabazi from the Campanian Maastrichtian Allen formation. So, the authors say, quote, it appears to indicate a transitional stage in the Unenlagine evolution. The name Diukin means bird of prey, whereas we would probably call it a raptor, but its name is from the Mapuzungun word, which is the language of the Mapuche people indigenous to that part of Argentina. And lechiguana refers to a witch of the same name from a 1975 film Nazarena Cruzi El Lobo, directed by, quote, eminent Argentinian filmmaker Leonardo Favio. So it boils down to lechiguana's bird of prey. The holotype MUCPV1404, housed at the Museo de Ciencias Naturales Universidad Nacional de Comayagua, was uncovered from the Bajo de la Carpa formation, and it's comprised of a sacral vertebral neural arch, an interior caudal vertebral neural arch, the almost complete left humerus, and 4 indeterminate bone fragments. So even though this is named based on some sparse remains, phylogenetic bracketing can help us picture this highly derived species of dromaeosaur. It's estimated to have been about 10 feet long. It was surely feathered, with a stiff tail due to lengthy chevrons and superior processes in the tail. It had a reduced second toe claw, so that famous raptorial claw of the dromaeosaur that has been reduced in unenlagines, and it had a very elongated snout, as well as slender, elongated hind limbs. So these would be tall walkers interpreted as wading in the water for their prey. And this discovery makes Diukin the first, quote, unenlagine theropod to be discovered from the Santonian Bajo de la Carpa formation, and it fills in a, quote, significant gap in their temporal distribution. The features on its humerus and vertebrae infer some transitional morphological changes between South American unenlagines from an earlier species, Unenlagia of the Turonian, many millions of years earlier than this, and the Austroraptor, which came in many millions of years after. But this creature's fossils also have another valuable detail in them. Quote, the humerus of the Diucan-type specimen exhibits two conical tooth marks that indicate that the carcass was fed upon by a tetrapod, which could have been either a crocodiliform, a mammal, or a theropod. Perhaps a megaraptorid represented by a tooth found at the same site, or even another Unulagine individual, potentially a member of the same species. Thus, the authors conclude, quote, in addition to filling important morphological and temporal gaps in Unulagine evolutionary history, the new taxon also offers information relating to the paleoecology of these theropods, or proof that even though they were predators, they also found themselves as prey. All right, the second news story today is Lokiceratops rangiformis from the Campanian Judith River Formation of Montana reveals rapid regional radiations and extreme endemism within centrosaurine dinosaurs, published June 20th, 2024 in the journal Peer J. There is some delightful alliteration at play in that title. This new creature suggests, quote, unprecedented ceratopsid richness, with 4 sympatric centrosaurine taxa and 1 chasmosaurine taxon. And the authors argue that their newly described species shows that there were a clade of centrosaurines restricted to a small portion of northern Laramidia approximately 78 million years ago. Recall, Laramidia was the continental western side of present-day North America, split from the eastern side by a shallow interior seaway, the eastern side named Appalachia. So, imagine Montana and Alberta, where these formations presently are being excavated, being on the coast of the interior seaway, living on a continent that spans from like Alaska to southern California, but just that western bit. So this new dinosaur, Lokiceratops rangiformis, derives its name from Norse mythology. Yes, that, Loki, and ceratops refers to it being a ceratopsian, or having a horned face, and rangiformis refers to the Latin name of a Norwegian species of reindeer, rangifer tarandus. The name refers to the horns and frill of Lokiceratops, with Loki referring to the trickster god's pointy crown, and rangifer somewhat describes the bilateral asymmetry of frill ornamentations, similar to what you'd see in a type of reindeer. What did Lokiceratops look like? Well, imagine a 20-plus foot long Triceratops to start, and then delete the nose horn, so there's just a round, smooth beak, and significantly reduce the brow horns down to 2 pointy projections that don't quite span, half the length of the snout. And then there's the frill. Imagine a fairly tall and upright frill all along its height, and a series of spurs or notches until you reach the top, where there are 2 hook-like horns that flop from the center out to each side, maybe like the handlebars on a kid's BMX, and there appears to be a projection or projections at the top center of the frill too, making this a strange, beastly, but beautiful collection of features. The holotype EMK0012, housed at the Museum of Evolution in Denmark, was uncovered from the Judith River Formation. It's comprised of many of the bones from the skull, as well as a posterior cervical vertebra, the synsacrum, and associated dorsal and caudal vertebrae, an isolated caudal vertebra and chevron, the fused right scapula and coracoid of the pectoral girdle, and both ilia and ischia of the pelvic girdle. So they dug up a significant portion of this guy. The authors identify Lokiceratops to be closely related to albertaceratops, medusaceratops, wendyceratops, and judyceratops, which are all known from the same paleo environments, and the authors erected a new clade to contain them all, albertaceratopsini. Lokiceratops, quote, is mostly closely related to albertaceratops nesmoi and medusaceratops lokii, both recovered in the same small geographic area and in sediments that indicate overlapping temporal distributions. Together, these data imply a rapid regional radiation of 5 distinct sympatric ceratopsid taxa: albertaceratops, Lokiceratops, medusaceratops, wendyceratops, and judyceratops. This new clade, albertaceratopsini, is, quote, geographically restricted within northern Laramidia, a pattern documented in other centrosaurine clades during the Campanian and early Maastrichtian. In other words, these types of centrosaurs have exclusive characteristics and are from a particular region or are endemic to northern Laramidia. The paper notes that other dinosaurs have been documented to be endemic as well, but, quote, so far the pattern of multiple regional radiations evidenced here appears to be unique among macroherbivorous dinosaurs, especially those with diverse cranial ornamentation, putatively related to sexual selection. Quote, high dinosaur endemicity implies that the diversity of dinosaurs in Laramidia was considerably higher than previously thought, because our limited geographic sampling limits our ability to recover species found in other parts of the continent. They conclude, quote, centrosaurine endemism was likely driven by a combination of factors, including climate-driven floral differences along a longitudinal gradient, dynamic tectonism, intense sexual selection, and interspecific resource competition, and is possibly analogous with regional radiations of sympatric lamiosaurine hadrosaurids, with the rapid speciation of dinosaurs in the Late Cretaceous of North America, resulting in intense competition that restricted geographic ranges. And if you thought that was interesting, I have a treat for you today. With the corrections and the dinosaur news out of the way, please let me introduce you to my special guest this episode. All right, my guest today is Dr. Mark A. Loewen, who is a paleontologist at the University of Utah and author of many academic papers on subjects like Tyrannosaur gigantism, the morphology and distribution of scales, dermal ossifications, and other non-feathered epidermal structures on non-avial and theropod dinosaurs. He's published on Jurassic beasts like Allosaurus, as well as on the strange and deviant ornamentations on ceratopsians, and literally dozens and dozens of other papers and books and abstracts and everything. How are you doing today?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. This is terrific. So we met 75 million years ago during the Campanian Age, just before the formation of the Rocky Mountains. I remember we were at the grocery store picking up bananas. There was only like one bunch left, and so we agreed to split it. And having gone Dutch on the purchase, it was clear that we didn't have enough bananas really to take home with us. So we just got to know each other over a few bananas out in the parking lot. But here's where it got interesting. You'll remember, while we were out there, Paul Bunyan and Bade the Big Blue Ox slipped on the banana peels and wound up wiping out, causing the formation of the Rocky Mountains all those years ago. So that was an exciting time to observe that.
Absolutely.
I'm excited to have you here because you spend your time analyzing and calculating what Utah and Montana were like 75 and 90 and 100 and 150 million years ago. If we're thinking back to the Late Cretaceous, just before the Rocky Mountains began to form, what would things have been like during that period?
The interesting thing when we talk about the Rocky Mountains only formed at the end of the time of the dinosaurs, like literally in the last 2 million years.
Okay.
But prior to that, there was something before the Rocky Mountains that stretched from Alaska all the way down to Mexico. We call them the Severe Mountains. And the Severe Mountains formed the spine of what was Western North America, separated from Eastern North America by the Western Interior Seaway.
That's astonishing stuff. So
like when we talk about Larimidia,
yeah,
we think about, Western North America is split in half by this ocean that stretches from the Arctic down to the Gulf of Mexico. That happened 100 million years ago. During that entire time, if you were on the east coast of Laramidia, it would have been very similar to today. So you could go to places like Calgary or Drumheller, and the mountains would be in the same place that they are today.
Really?
And then there would be floodplains, and then the coast of the ocean, right about where the Alberta-Saskatchewan border was. So, a little bit of a different world. It would have been more like the Louisiana Delta along the coast, but yet there would be mountains. We actually think at some points there were snow on the top of the mountains, not glaciers, but certainly snow. Some of the isotopes that we recover from them actually suggest there was snow, because snow has a lighter form of oxygen isotopes in it than does rain. So there's some evidence there was snow, but pretty much we're talking subtropical jungles that these dinosaurs are living in.
Interesting. That's really cool. And it's hard imagining how the continents were different back then. And I like to look at maps, but they're always dubious in terms of what kind of quality has gone into making these reconstructions of what the world was like back then. But yeah, it's fascinating to think that the Midwest and the Western area was a seaside. That's just so strange back then. But a lot can happen over a couple million years, that's for sure.
Beachfront property in the middle of Saskatchewan. What's amazing is why this happened.
Okay.
Right? So people are like, why would you have this seaway splitting North America in half? And the answer goes back to the supercontinent of Pangea. Dinosaurs evolve on the supercontinent of Pangea. Most people have heard about that. But as dinosaurs are evolving through their time here on Earth, Pangea starts to break up. We get the invention of the Atlantic Ocean between the Triassic and the Jurassic. As that starts to widen, other continents start to break up. We break up the northern continents, Laurasia, from the southern continents that we call Gondwana, and then they further break up. So by the time of this new dinosaur that we're talking about, by the time of T-Rex, the continents are much closer to their current positions. And it turns out the continents were moving apart so fast that the magma that was coming up in the middle of the new ocean basins didn't have time to cool. This actually forced the water from the oceans onto the land. So the reason that we have these seaways covering North America and splitting North America in half, splitting Africa in half, covering most of Europe, these seaways are from the water that was forced up onto the land because the plates on Earth are moving apart so fast.
Wow. So like the sea floor just came up that high and it displaced all the water.
Yeah.
Oh my, that's incredible. That's horrifying in a way. Cataclysmic, but my goodness.
In a lot of ways, that sea level rise, and the sea level goes up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down in North America, that actually created the conditions to create the Tyrannosaurs that end up being T-Rex and the ceratopsians that end up being Triceratops. These animals were all over the world, but they only evolved in those specialized ways on Western North America.
Yeah, it was a special place. So yeah, we're in terms of like the Triceratops, we're talking today about the new species that your paper came out on the 20th. How long was it in the chamber ready to go? I know you guys were waiting for that to come out.
You know, this one actually went relatively fast. The dinosaur was found in 2019, and then it was purchased by a museum in 2022. So that's when the research started. And we actually submitted the paper for the first time to a scientific journal in February of 2023. And then we've been going back and forth with reviewers to make sure that the paper's up to snuff. It is quite a long paper, but yeah, never have we really had a paper in which 1 year of research, 1 year in development, and then the paper's out. So it's relatively fast-tracked. Sometimes it takes us 10 to 15 years to write up a new species that we find.
Well, that's pretty good. So having been purchased might explain part of why Denmark appears to be heavily involved in all of this. Well, this is interesting. Okay, good. So we're talking about the new Lokiceratops that just came out. And it's an incredibly strange-looking ceratopsian and a centrosaur that people might know about. Maybe they've seen the artwork already. You were able to share some terrific pictures, I think, that really go a long ways to illustrating what a special animal this might have been. Were you part of the excavation team or just the research team?
No, so this was found by one guy who went out and dug it up with some friends. But in the U.S., we have a little bit different rules. So the rules are, if you have private land and you find a dinosaur on your private land, that belongs to you. And that can be sold to whoever you like. So as scientists, we can't actually work on a specimen unless it's in a museum. So a rich guy could buy a dinosaur, put it in his living room. That doesn't exist to us as scientists. So fortunately for us, the Museum of Evolution in Denmark is a new museum opening up. They are really interested in supporting research, and we were able to get them to purchase the specimen and actually lead the research on it. So it's pretty cool. This specimen could have been lost to some private collector somewhere, but actually the specimen was saved for science, and we got to tell the story.
Now, is the reason that the field generally will not work on a privately held specimen, is it because it's hard to double check somebody's work when it's when it's privately held, whereas if it's in a public institution, people can verify and collaborate and double check?
Right.
Okay.
It's the repeatability of science.
Yeah.
So if it's in somebody's living room, maybe they're not going to let other researchers who disagree come to look at the specimen.
Right.
Anybody who disagrees with what we say about Lokiceratops are free to go and actually look at the specimen. The specimen was found, the skull was fragmented into probably 80 different pieces. But we were able to actually piece them together. And sometimes when a skull is put on display, we actually glue all those pieces back together, and you can never take them apart again. We've actually mounted this skull in a way that every bone can be removed for study, which is pretty cool.
That's interesting. I know the Danish well, with the Legos and all, they're very good at putting things together. So that's fascinating. What a great place for it to be then. So,
And actually, there's a copy of the bones at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto.
Great. Oh, great. We'll be right beside the Wendy Ceratops, I think, there. That's excellent.
That's right.
Awesome. So at what point when you're reviewing the fossils, or it's in the museum or it's been purchased, do people begin to realize that this is actually a very special new animal instead of, I don't know, sometimes a ceratopsia might be common looking, I guess. I don't know. At what point did it become something where you're like, oh, this is actually quite unique?
The cool thing is we were standing around a table. This specimen was actually sold as being Medusaceratops,
Okay.
which is a poorly known ceratopsian from Montana. It actually comes from a quarry that's only 2 miles away from where Lokiceratops was found. But as we're setting it out on the table, my students and I were piecing the bones back together, and we start to say, that's not right. That's not right. And literally standing around a table putting these pieces back together, you get the eureka moment, and it's like, we have a new dinosaur. This does not fit into the kinds of variation that we expect within a single species, between juveniles and adults. It really is something completely different. And it turns out this animal didn't have a nose horn. This animal had a completely different pattern of the horns on its frill. There's lots of different things that make this a completely new dinosaur, which was shocking. We would not expect to have what it turns out we have 5 different elephant-sized ceratopsians living at the same time in the same place in an area smaller than downtown Toronto.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, some of the observations, conclusions in that paper really start to impress that there's something unusual but exciting going on there for sure.
And the cool thing is we're actually starting to see the same evidence in some other places. So we haven't finished all the work yet, but this is not going to be the only example of this hyperdiversity, which means, as paleontologists, we just need to keep looking because there are more dinosaurs out there.
Yes, I recall reading the part about that it's beginning to demonstrate that there is a pattern. And when you know that there's a pattern, you can start looking to see. That's really cool. Wow, what a tip of the iceberg moment. That's really cool.
When I started working on horned dinosaurs, we knew for a fact that you could have one centrosaur and one chasmosaur at any given time in any given place. For sure. You would never have more than 2. And, as we've found specimens over the years, and we have very, very precise dating, even down to on the order of 50,000 year resolution, it's becoming clear that there's more. So this makes us ask the question, okay, so why? You couldn't go to the Serengeti today and get out of your safari vehicle and see 5 species of elephants. Just isn't going to happen.
No, I can't imagine. My goodness.
You might see 2 rhinos if you're lucky, but the rhinos do different things. So what is it? What is it about these animals that makes them so diverse? And it turns out the same things that we recognize in these animals that make them different species to paleontologists are likely the same things that they're looking at to differentiate themselves into different species, and the kinds of things that they're looking at in order to mate and compete with rivals. So we really are starting to think about these animals more like birds rather than giant elephants. Because like birds, they're looking at the ornaments on their heads. So one of the questions I get is about Lokiceratops are, why did you put those ornaments? Why did you color it the color you colored it? But like, this animal's not trying to hide.
Yeah.
This animal is showing off. This is a peacock of the Cretaceous.
Yeah, it's got a peacock face. Yeah. Incredible stuff. So one of the things that impressed me in a lot of academic papers, but including this one, you mentioned it took about a year for the reviews and the edits because you wanted it to be up to snuff. Almost every sentence has like 2 footnotes at least, showing that there is a ton packed in every statement that is corroborated and built upon the work that's come before, especially when you know that you want to use it as a springboard into looking at the broader patterns of other things. So, I mean, there's so much that goes into every sentence. It's incredible. I wonder at what point does the decision come to say, hey, this is cool enough that we should get some corresponding artwork. We should invest in something else to help mediate and celebrate this discovery. What goes into the decisions to invest more into a story like this when you're coming up with the press releases?
So, if it's a cool dinosaur, and to us, this is a cool dinosaur,
it is,
right?
Objectively a cool dinosaur.
The biggest of the centrosaurs, and it's got these giant canoe paddles sticking off the side of its head shield. It's pretty cool. So we knew that we could get artists excited about it, and so we went to multiple different artists across the globe to get their take on it. Unfortunately, since the paper was in review for about a year, and keep in mind, this paper is almost 100 pages long, so it's not an easy paper to review. It's not an easy paper to get everybody into agreement on. But we wanted to be thorough, especially since the specimen is going permanently to Denmark. So if scientists can't make it over to Denmark, we wanted to document it as well as we could in photos and things like that. But again, for the general public, we can talk about all the different details of the anatomy in the paper. Most people are not going to read that. What you need are the visuals to make it real to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're really great, and I know perhaps I didn't. Well, you'll let me know if I read the media release correctly. But did you produce the skeletal drawing?
Yeah.
That's incredible. So I know that I can't imagine people who study dinosaurs that don't like to draw dinosaurs. Is that something that you've enjoyed doing? Is something you love to do?
It's just part of making the figures, right? So
okay.
Take each individual fragment and put it together into the bigger skull, and then now you have the skull. It's relatively easy just to put the rest of the bones onto the body as well.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So you mentioned that it was purchased by the Museum of Evolution in Denmark. Does that also contribute to, it's named after Loki, who's from Norse mythology, and it's named after as well a species of reindeer that's also from Denmark. Do these things, I'm trying to say, are these all related because it was honoring the people who've supported the work?
The interesting thing is, the other dinosaur that it's only 2 miles away from
mm-hmm.
is actually called Medusaceratops lokii.
Yes.
So we just wanted to confuse everybody. Not true. Since it was going to Denmark, we figured it's time to name a dinosaur after a Norse god.
Yeah.
And then we had decided on that before we really even understood what the frill looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And then the frill ends up looking like many of the depictions of Loki, with the horns coming off the helmet and the giant blades. So in the end, it was just serendipitous. The other thing about the frill is it's different from the right side to the left side.
Mm-hmm.
There's variation like you would see in the antlers of a caribou. So we named it, Loki's horn face that looks like a caribou.
And that's just equally as fitting. It's incredible how that all sometimes it's an art finding the right name that makes that pulls in all the right strings. It
is. Our research team has we have a philosophy. If you come up with a new dinosaur name, it needs to be easy to say
mm-hmm.
and something that's memorable. So sometimes people use long descriptive names.
Mm-hmm.
Our bias is to go with something that's memorable and relatively easy to say.
I think I was talking to Dr. Jim Kirkland, and he was saying, I want people to be excited about the new discoveries. I want people to be excited about the dinosaurs. You can't call them all Epistocaudia or something like that. It's just not going to work. So you got to come up with something fun. So I'm glad that went into it as well. That's cool. Yeah. Now, so I review the systematic paleontology of the new animal. It's an ornithischian as described by Seeley in 1887, a ceratopsian as is described by Marsh in 1890, centrosaurine as described by Lamb in 1815, and then it looks like you may have declared a new clade of centrosaurs, the albertaceratopsini. Is it a hard I at the end like that?
It would be albertaceratopsini.
Okay. All right, good.
So
I prefer that.
A clade that clades together with albertaceratops, medusaceratops, and Lokiceratops. I'm generally against doing that, but if we didn't, somebody would come back and name it for us. And by precedent, since albertaceratops was named first of the three animals in that clade, it needs to be albertaceratopsini.
Okay.
But every time we do a new family tree and we find more specimens, the clades change and the names change. So it's just something we had to do in this paper, but it's a group that groups together. I'm confident they are related to each other. So there you go. So now we have, at the base of the tree of centrosaurs, we have nasutoceratopsini, which actually shouldn't be nasutoceratopsini. It should be avaceratopsini.
Yeah, okay.
But, they got that wrong. So it's just lawyering of different names in the middle of the paper, which is unfortunate.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I had a great professor in university, and his comment on making an essay or making your argument was that you need to think like a detective but write like a lawyer. And
Yes.
and when you look at some of these things like the specifics, I don't want to be misunderstood. This is the case that I'm arguing. And you see it in academic papers. You see it when paleontologists are trying to be clear about what they are and are not saying. And it must be a challenging tightrope to walk to say, this is what I'm telling you. Please don't misunderstand. So that's fascinating. And you can see it in the work. Like I said, all those footnotes, all the work that goes into it to be declarative and authoritative and to be correct. So, like I mentioned, when you look into the systematics, it mentions marsh beside those names. It mentions lamb, and it's corroborated by guys like Dodson and Serino, whose name will go beside the next albertaceratopsini that people find.
That would be Loewen and Sertich.
Ah, that's pretty good. Wow, leaving your mark. That's incredible. And not that you haven't. I've seen some of the stuff that's gone in the past too. Really cool.
At the same time, I'm less proud about albertaceratopsini than I am about something like, Vegaceratops or,
So in terms of like centrosaurs in the book Jurassic Park, the novel gives us one. It's the styracosaurus, and it's not portrayed or described at all. It's literally just in a table on a list of dinosaurs that happen to be out in the park. But it sort of fits into this observation on centrosaurs your paper makes, in terms that it's a species known from Montana and Alberta, but not further anywhere else. And it kind of matches the pattern that's seen in, I think you guys were listing like hadrosaurs and chasmosaurs and pachycephalosaurs and tyrannosaurs, that they had a limited geographic range. Does the styracosaurus fit into that pattern as well?
Right now, styracosaurus is known from one species that's basically just in Dinosaur Park in Alberta, and then another species that's in Montana. From specimens that I'm aware of that aren't published, it still has less than a 200-mile range. So, we don't find this animal or anything like it in Utah or New Mexico or Texas or Mexico. But interesting that you talk about Jurassic Park. In some of the more recent movies, we have gotten centrosaurs back into the mix. In Fallen Kingdom, we got sinoceratops from China. And then in Dominion, we got nasutoceratops, which is a centrosaurine. So they're definitely out there in the Jurassic Park world. And being one of the co-authors naming nasutoceratops means that I exist in the Jurassic Park extended universe.
There you go.
That makes me happy.
You belong, yes. Well, I was thinking if John Hammond were looking to build a park where the dinosaurs weren't eager to escape their pens and move around, you should probably invest there in more centrosaurs. They will happily stay put, in a way. So you mentioned that there are a couple centrosaurs. They're also in Jurassic Park. What is, I guess, the defining difference between a chasmosaur and a centrosaur?
That's a great question. So when I started in paleontology, we were taught that chasmosaurs have long eye horns, short nose horns, and centrosaurs have relatively shorter frills, short eye horns, and long nose horns.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is out now. So there are chasmosaurs with short frills, there are chasmosaurs with short eye horns, there are centrosaurs with long eye horns, and it really comes down to, is your nose round or is your nose oval shaped? So things like Triceratops and Chasmosaurus, the chasmosaurines, they have elongated oval shaped snouts. Whereas the centrosaurs like styracosaurus, centrosaurus, Lokiceratops, they have round noses.
Mm-hmm. And I think Jurassic World does a good job with the nasutoceratops nose, and you really get that centrosaurine shape,
Yes.
which is nice. Well, that's good.
And
Okay.
Nasutoceratops has the biggest nose opening of any centrosaur, so it's the perfect poster child.
Oh, right on. So yeah, I wanted to get into nasutoceratops. So the chasmosaurs have lots of strange frills, and horn arrangements, and we're talking centrosaurs today. They also have surprising ones, and I remember the nasutoceratops, and I think it was 2016. I know because I checked your CV, and because you were involved in that as well. When it came out, it was like a eye-opening moment to think that the horn arrangement could be that deviant from what you might expect from a triceratops. So it has a horn shape similar to like a longhorn steer, with like a lateral projection before it moves forward, whereas a triceratops just kind of moves out straight forwards. And then it was obviously wholly embraced for being strange by the Jurassic World creative team, and has since become quite popular. And now we got like there's so much variety in the centrosaurs and the ceratopsians now. When you got launched into this, did you expect to be amidst this age of discovery where the centrosaurs are doing so much more than perhaps was envisioned at the time?
Well, and stuff we wouldn't expect, right?
Yeah.
So Nasutoceratops has a boring frill. It's just round with little nubbins coming off of it, right? What is sexy to Nasutoceratops are those giant sideways curling horns, right? So each animal is going in different directions. At the same time, Lokiceratops has a really interesting frill compared to Nasutoceratops. So each one is just going in different directions. Mm-hmm. The cool thing is, here in Utah, we knew there had to be something out there that was a centrosaur. So we were looking for it. We started digging in Grand Staircase in 2000. So Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument has the Caperwitz Formation, which is the same age as Dinosaur Park in Canada. And so we had a chasmosaurine in both Cosmoceratops and Utaceratops. But we knew there had to be a centrosaurine. But it took us about 8 years to find it. So then it finally came out, and we were totally proud. We're actually still looking for more, right? So part of this whole story where you can have up to 5, there's more diversity in those rocks that we still haven't teased out.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting promise. Well, yeah, and so I think the question about, why they had different frills and such a high level of speciation is one thing, but maybe the better question is, what questions does seeing this incredible diversity of big species in one area, what kind of questions does that provoke paleontologists to ask about the environment and in the world that they were living in?
One of the things that's interesting is we're getting better and better stratigraphic control, where we actually know where the ash beds are, and we can actually figure out that these things live together. One of the arguments has been it's just a single lineage, and you're sampling it at January, May, September, and December, and really it's just one species for that entire time, but it's just changing a little bit so that you're recognizing it as 5 different species. That's actually not the case. We're actually seeing true speciation events rather than just antigenetic change over time.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's incredible that that the world would let them all coexist, or they could find space for them. They must have been specialized in different ways. I mean, they couldn't have been
So
directly competing, right?
we do think that chasmosaurines and centrosaurines eat in a little bit different way because their beaks are formed in a different way. But if you have four chasmosaurines or four centrosaurines in the same environment, they're effectively the same animal. So we're starting to think of these animals more like birds, right? Of course, birds are living dinosaurs, but they came from the theropod side. But if you went and you took all of the birds of paradise today, took all their feathers off, handed them to a paleontologist, the paleontologist would say, oh, it's one species. Right? But then when you look at the plumage, obviously they're different species. When you look at the mating behaviors and the courtship rituals that these animals have, they're all different species. And they all basically live in eastern Indonesia area. So this is the kind of thing where sexual selection has taken them and allowed more diversity of animals that do the same thing because they're partitioned not ecologically, but by mating preference. So you can go to the lakes in Africa, like Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi, and these lakes are full of cichlid fish. But the species diversity of those cichlid fish is ridiculous because they all have different colorations and different mating rituals for mating. So you can support 60, 70 different species of the same fish. Skeletally would look the same to a paleontologist because sexual selection is driving the diversity rather than ecological partitioning. So we're starting to think that some groups of dinosaurs, like the horned dinosaurs, are really affected by sexual selection in the same way that modern birds and some fish are today.
All right, I had, I guess, two more questions, well, I guess, about centrosaurines that I think would be interesting. I would love to... I haven't had really somebody that specializes in such things, so I wanted to ask about some of the holes that are in their skulls, if you don't mind. You mentioned before that the nasutoceratops has some of the largest nasal cavities of the other centrosaurs. I know Triceratops on the other side has a huge nasal cavity. You could put my head into it if you chose. They have big noses. What might they have been doing with that large of a cavity to sniff with?
It's a great question. I don't think we understand. So this animal is going to have a slit-like nostril, like most animals do, at the front part of its snout. And then it has a giant chamber that's covered with flesh. So is it cooling and moistening the air? Is it using it for sound? Or is it actually using the air sacs to change the shape of the snout, both functionally for eating and to look impressive for sexual selection? I think all of those things are probably going on. But even more bizarre, these animals have an air sac on top of their brain case that extends up into the horns. It extends up into an open hole on the top of the head between the horns, and then extends back onto the frill into the area where the fenestrae on the frill are. It's this bizarre air sac system. I mean, obviously, if you've heard yourself talk on Zoom, you don't sound like you sound, right? Because you sound differently inside of your head because your head is a resonating chamber. So if you hear a recording of yourself talking, that's not what you actually sound like. Or actually, that is what you sound like, but it's not like
It's not what you hear when you speak, yeah.
Right? So, maybe this is affecting that. Who knows? We really don't understand. Like, having air sacs between your eye horns, and especially maybe if you're fighting with eye horns, you could easily pierce that. We just really don't understand. But it's an extensive air sac system. So the skull of a ceratopsian, it looks big and heavy. In a lot of ways, the openings on the frill, the openings around the nose go throughout the head, and maybe some of it is to make the head as light as possible. So you just have struts of bone here and there. We really don't understand. And one of the things in this paper, we actually talk about the internal passages within the skull and describe them for the first time. Right? So there's a passage for the jaw muscles. There's a passage for, we don't know what. I mean, obviously, there's the passage for the air to come from the nose down into the throat. But there are other chambers within that system, like right below the eyes, there's chambers on the inside. So it's pretty interesting. They really are airheads.
I wonder. So it's reasonable to think that they would be able to suck air in, and then that would circulate all around all parts of the skull.
Probably not.
Okay.
Like, sometimes if you hold your nose,
yes,
you get some air coming out of your eye areas.
Okay.
There is some communication, but no, you couldn't inflate maybe the frill from the air sacs in the nose. Okay. The nose is separate, but what are these things doing? We just don't know.
Okay. I was just, you were describing it as like, oh no, it's going to have to be like a flotation device, and they just pull a cord here.
Imagine if you've got a cold.
Oh, yeah.
All the mucus that would be coming out of the nose of that ceratopsian dinosaur.
So, one of the things I wonder...
It's all covered with soft tissue on the inside.
One of the things I was wondering about was whether or not they might have been able to drink salt water and somehow reject excess salt from the water through some sort of duct in that respect. But when I started thinking about like flowering plants and things like that, I wonder if a sense of smell, maybe there was something like lavender and they just really were drawn to areas that had that. Or I wonder if just there's so many things that a big nose could be doing. It's hard to imagine.
It's difficult, right?
Yeah.
You think about Parasaurolophus, right?
Yes.
Parasaurolophus has that air comes in the front of the snout, goes 5 feet back to the back of the head, comes all the way back, goes down to the forehead. Wow, I bet that thing could smell really well. Or I bet that thing could sound really well. I don't think either of those things were true. I think Parasaurolophus is stretching out its nasal passage in order to make an ornament on the top of its head, just like ceratopsians. So I think part of the big nose of ceratopsians is looking sexy. Does that make you better at smelling? Probably not. But it does make you better at chopping up vegetation if you're a centrosaurine. Centrosaurines have a different style of beak that has a cutting surface that's different than Triceratops. So maybe they're eating in a different way. And people, since the 80s have been talking about, flowering plants show up, ceratopsians go crazy. Flowering plants show up, hadrosaurs go crazy. So did flowers invent ceratopsians and hadrosaurs in the way that we think of, Edmontosaurus and Triceratops? It's possible. Were these things eating angiosperms? I'm sure of it. And they're eating them in a different way. So if you go back to the ceratopsians that were alive before flowering plants evolved, they have individual cheek teeth. By the time you get to the ceratopsids, they put all of their teeth together into these elongated blades of garden shears. That's a different way of eating than any dinosaur had ever done. You could put a baseball bat in the mouth of a ceratopsian and they would cut it into 3 pieces. A slice on each side with a chunk in the middle. So that way of processing food had never, ever been done in dinosaurs. Ceratopsians couldn't chew gum, but they could slice, baseball bats into chunks. So I think these animals are taking branches, chopping them up, swallowing them. We may have the poop of ceratopsians, and it seems to be full of wood and sticks and branches. I don't know.
What a puzzle. It's not fair in some respects, isn't it? Interesting stuff. And then you were mentioning the fenestra in the frills. Might they be? Is there reason to believe they might have supported some sort of musculature, or you mentioned that they could have perhaps been blushing or cooling, or what are some of the things that they may have been doing with the vacancies in the frills?
The jaw muscles originate at the front part of the frill. So people in the past have said, well, the frill is an extension to make that jaw muscle longer. But muscles actually leave behind scars. Mm-hmm. So, it wasn't muscles. And at the same time, if you have a muscle that's 5 feet long, it's no stronger than a muscle that's 1 foot long if it has the same cross-sectional area, which they do. So there's no mechanical advantage in having a longer muscle. So it's not for muscles. Mm-hmm. It's full of blood vessels. So, yeah, maybe it could blush. I think really the holes in the frill are just to make the frill bigger and lighter. Mm-hmm. So the reason you have the holes is so you can put as much energy into making it as impressive as you can. I think about the frills of centrosaurine dinosaurs as the fantail of a peacock. Mm-hmm. It's a display structure.
Well, it would be powerfully useful in terms of you get noticed. It would definitely do that. Huh.
Right.
Well, that's fascinating stuff. I guess the only other thing that really I think matches between Jurassic Park and centrosaurs that I was able to really cobble together in terms of an interesting idea is there's an element of Jurassic Park that somewhat gets overlooked because of the amber, but one of the sources of their DNA is to crush up fossils and extract DNA from the fossils using a process called Loy's procedure, which is in some of the video games and things like that. It kind of got overlooked in the book, and in practicality, I don't know that it was ever going to be a real thing, but the idea would be, should you find lots of the same animal, you might be able to extract a lot of, theoretically, the DNA from the fossils. And I try to think, well, I know that centrosaurines, I think in Saskatchewan, there is an incredible bone bed of a great source of centrosaurs. Are they a type of animal that you find commonly alone, or do they come in herds or big bone beds? What's the common experience on a centrosaur?
We think that centrosaurines lived in herds. Mm-hmm. Because we find them in bone beds. Why do we find them in bone beds? Probably because of hurricanes. Okay. So there are bone beds of Centrosaurus, Coronosaurus, Ioneosaurus, Medusaceratops. There are several. And really, you have this elongate seaway coming from the Gulf of Mexico. Right. And, some of the geologists, like Dave Eberth in Canada, have suggested that these bone beds that you get in Alberta are probably from storm surge, from hurricanes.
Okay, and that's
yeah, they seem to live in groups and die together.
Mm. Are there other types of animals you find? I think I was hearing that there's a great collection of allosaurs somewhere that wound up all together. Is there other types of examples where dinosaurs are in great big groups? I think Coelophysis is a popular one.
Yeah. Coelophysis is probably trapped in a flash flood.
Yeah.
So it just wiped everything off of the forest floor together. And yeah, it probably was in a group and got killed together. There's lots of questions about Allosaurus with the Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry. I tend to think it's a flood deposit, and then the water standing and the bodies just floating on the surface. So I think all of the Allosaur fossils in Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry were killed during a flood event, and then they collected together hydraulically as balloons of dead animals. Mm. But we do have some instances in which we have 3 or more tyrannosaurs together. So people invoke, was it pack hunting? The interesting thing when we talk about Jurassic Park, we think about packs of velociraptors, right? We've never found two velociraptors together, ever. Right? It's interesting.
That's
and
fair.
then going back to your DNA thing, what you have to remember, DNA has a half-life in which it deteriorates. And the half-life is the same as carbon.
Okay.
So we can't use carbon dating to look at dinosaurs for the same reason that we can't get DNA from
It is
dinosaurs.
expired
Because
a
it's
long time
all
ago.
degraded. We get fingernail for sure, which is amazing. I've literally seen the beaks of dinosaurs and it's still keratin. I've seen the claws of dinosaurs and it's still keratin. But we're not getting DNA out of that. So a couple different labs were working on, if you want to get a dinosaur, you reverse engineer the dinosaur information in bird DNA. So, getting a dino chicken would be possible. You could change the different indicators to get teeth in a chicken, or get separate leg bones. So a couple labs were working on dino chicken projects, but I expect somebody will figure out some way to make some mutant dinosaur-like bird. But yeah, we're just the cool thing about Jurassic Park is every time they dug up amber, they found a known species of dinosaur.
Isn't that the way? Yeah.
We know less than 1% or even 0.1% of the dinosaurs that ever lived. But every one that we found amber from, even where we don't have amber from those ages, ended up with a named dinosaur.
I've wondered if hypothetically one were to be suddenly transported back right into the center of the Mesozoic at some point, the odds of actually stepping out and seeing a dinosaur that has been described is tremendously unlikely.
Or even if it was described,
Yeah.
it wouldn't look right to you because somebody has put feathers and fur and scales and skin on it that don't actually match.
It just doesn't. The reality will be far more incomprehensible than we can imagine. Well, that's really cool stuff. Yeah, and what a strange sample that the world we created off this imagination of looking at what fossils show us about dinosaurs is this. It's a real fantasy, and it's really hard to, like we were saying, being specific and talking like a lawyer. Most of that fantasy is, people's best wishes and great hypotheses, but it's so hard to confirm almost anything other than they had bones. It's fascinating stuff.
So for Lokiceratops, we actually built a life-size head replica. But the interesting thing is, when you're talking about what kind of skin was on a centrosaur, nasutoceratops is preserved with skin on its shoulder. So we actually have a really interesting pattern of triangles and hexagons. It literally looks like a soccer ball. And so we actually use that skin pattern from Nasutoceratops for Lokiceratops' head. And then when you look at the skin, it looks like the skin that's on the arm of a chameleon.
Okay.
So that's kind of why we chose, we actually had chosen that color scheme before we were even sure we were going to name it Lokiceratops. Now, I know Loki is associated with green and things like that, but we actually were trying to mimic the skin pattern that you see in something like a panther chameleon.
I think the eyeball might have borrowed from that idea as well. Maybe.
In the end, the eyeball was like the only thing of the right size that we could find. So we got
Well, it's a remarkable paper and a remarkable animal, and I'm sure you guys must be very excited about it.
Definitely.
How's the response? How has the response been?
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to spend some time with me today. Can't believe how much time you've take it away from the important things you should be doing to be here. So thank you so much. It's been incredible. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
All right, a terrific thank you to Dr. Mark A. Loewen for coming on the show and sharing all those details. Centrosaurs are so incredible. They are also so strange, and they're so confusing. All right, for today's discussion, I figured perhaps I'll revisit the Loy's procedure and how it relates to Jurassic Park one final time. And obviously, we'll continue with reviewing the film and its screenplay, identifying all the references to the source text, continuing with the second scene, the Encased Mosquito. So, Loy's procedure. In the novel, we're told that Hammond was funding northern digs. It was somewhat mysterious, too. The Hammond Foundation was funding only northern digs. On page 32, we're introduced to Alan Grant in Snakewater, Montana, that's described as specifically in, quote, northern Montana on page 32. Then arrives Bob Morris from the EPA. Quote, well, Morris said, the Hammond Foundation is actually a rather mysterious organization. He pulled out a Xerox world map, marked with red dots, and passed it to Grant. Quote, these are the digs the Foundation financed last year. Notice anything odd about them? Montana, Alaska, Canada, Sweden. They're all sites in the north. There's nothing below the 45th parallel. Morris pulled out more maps. It's the same year after year. Dinosaur projects to the south in Utah or Colorado or Mexico never get funded. The Hammond Foundation only supports cold weather digs. We'd like to know why. On page 35. And finally, on page 398, Dr. Marty Gutierrez is visiting Dr. Grant, asking about Hammond some more, and Gutierrez sits next to Grant, and he says, you must be eager to go home. Yes, Grant said. I have only a few days left to dig before the winter sets in. In Montana, you know, the first snow usually comes in August. Gutierrez said, is that why the Hammond Foundation supported northern digs? Because intact genetic material from dinosaurs was more likely to be recovered from cold climates? That's what I presume, yes. So in the Jurassic Park universe, northern digs are more likely to preserve intact genetic material from dinosaurs. Asterisk. Of course, in real life this isn't true, but in a world where the Hammond Foundation only supports northern digs, one man, using Loy's procedure, will discover 20% of the proteins are still recoverable. All right, Henry Wu tells the inspectors on their tour, using the Loy antibody extraction technique, we can sometimes get DNA directly from dinosaur bones. What kind of a yield, Grant asks Wu. Well, most soluble protein is leached out during fossilization, but 20% of the proteins are still recoverable by grinding up the bones and using Loy's procedure. Dr. Loy himself has used it to obtain proteins from extinct Australian marsupials, as well as blood cells from ancient human remains. This technique is so refined we can work with a mere 50 nanograms of material. That's 50 billionths of a gram. And you've adapted his technique here, Grant asked. Only as a backup, Wu said. As you can imagine, a 20% yield is insufficient for our work. We need the entire dinosaur DNA strand in order to clone. And we get it here. And he holds up a yellow stone from amber, the fossilized resin of prehistoric tree sap. And that's on page 99. So this procedure is coolly name-dropped by Crichton, alluding to Thomas H. Loy. Loy was from Canberra, Australia, and he developed a technique for lifting splotches of blood from stone tools and bones and then extract bits of genetic material. This was a real guy who cut his teeth in 1983 studying 104 stone tools unearthed from British Columbia with blood samples on almost all of them from a variety of animals like black-tailed deer, moose, snowshoe rabbits, caribou, and grizzly bears, and some had human blood. So that's extracting DNA from old blood, but not from crushing up fossilized bones. Second, the artifacts were maxing out at about 50,000 years old, not 100 million years old. So like Loy's procedure sounds like something that's applicable here, but it's another example of Crichton name-dropping something that isn't real. But it sounds real because it's based on something that is real, and so we blow right on past it, believing that it could be true. And in fact, if you wanted to write science fiction, this is a great template upon which to do the very same thing. Find something real, refer to how it works generally, and then employ terrific exaggeration in its abilities. In fact, you could just, say something like an advancement in the application of Loy's procedure recently developed over at Cambridge, and then you're off to the races. Science fiction. It's easy as that. Loy's procedure has been applied primarily, as far as I can tell, in archaeology, like in a paper from the Journal of Field Archaeology in 1989 called Blood Residue Analysis at Kanoyu Tepsi, Turkey. I'm probably not pronouncing Turkish localities correctly. In that paper, a program of blood residue analysis was undertaken from 1984 to 1987, which began as an investigation into the feasibility of detecting and identifying blood residues in a field setting, with a subsequent additional analyses and verification in the home laboratory. In another of Loy's papers, The Artifact as Site, an example of the biomolecular analyses of organic residues on prehistoric tools, published in World Archaeology in 1993, he was able to analyze tools using methods, quote, drawn from microscopy, biochemistry, radiocarbon dating, and molecular biology, results in information which can be at least as informative as excavation-based reconstructions of past cultures. Quote, the analysis of a collection of tools from a now destroyed site in northwestern Canada yields species identification of the residues, the age and task association of the tools, and necessitates a change to the reconstruction of the subsistence and economy of the late prehistoric period in the region. And it's implied that the Hammond Foundation was in some way associated with the discarded rejects Ellie described at their dig site in Montana. So on page 34, what about those? Morris said, pointing through the trailer window to a pile of large bones outside wrapped in heavy plastic. So these are large bones. Rejects, Ellie said. Bones too fragmentary when we took them out of the ground. In the old days, we'd just discard them, but nowadays, we send them for genetic testing. Genetic testing, Morris said. And then furthermore on page 41, Dr. Sattler mentioned you do some genetic work here. Well, not exactly, Grant said. When we remove fossils that are broken or for some other reason not suitable for museum preservation, we send the bones out to a lab that grinds them up and tries to extract proteins for us. The proteins are then identified and the report is sent back to us. Which lab is that? Morris asked. Medical Biological Services in Salt Lake. How'd you choose them? Competitive bids. The lab has nothing to do with InGen, Morris asked. Not that I know of, Grant said. So is Medical Biological Services affiliated with Jurassic Park and the Hammond Foundation? Wu says they, in fact, extract proteins, just like Medical Biological Services does, according to Grant. Might there be an unspoken connection? Maybe, right? In any case, I'm positive that fossils aren't being shipped to Wu at Jurassic Park to be ground up and have proteins extracted from them via Loy's procedure, as a backup plan for their DNA acquisition. Surely they have a site that does that for them, and they just get whatever they need delivered to them afterwards, right? Okay, let's resume our analysis, or comparative analysis of the script and what was in the final product of Jurassic Park with the novel and see all the references that we can derive from the source text. All right, the scene begins with the anxious lawyer Donald Gennaro balancing his weight on a raft being pulled onto the land. He looks out of place. And the screen caption reads, Mano de Dios Amber Mine, Dominican Republic. There's a guy named Juanito, and he speaks in Spanish. It translates to I bet 1,000 pesos that he falls. And then Donald says, Hola, Juanito. And Juanito says, Hola, buenvenido, which means, welcome here. And Gennaro says, what's it say here at the airport? Hammond's not even here? He sends his apologies. We're facing a $20 million lawsuit by the family of that worker, and you're telling me Hammond can't even be bothered to see me? He had to leave early. He wants to be with his daughter. She's getting a divorce. Well, I understand that, but we've been advised to deal with the situation now. He goes, yeah, the underwriters feel the accident has raised some very serious safety questions about the park. That makes the investors very, very anxious, and I had to promise to conduct a very thorough on-site inspection. Hammond just hates inspections. They slow everything down. Juanito, they'll pull the funding. That'll slow them down even more. And then somebody goes, hey, boss, we found another mosquito. And he says, are you sure? And he goes, yeah, I'm sure. Come on. So they go in there into this cave, and Juanito says, watch your head. And Gennaro says, if 2 experts sign off on the island, the insurance guys will back off. I already got Ian Malcolm, but they think he's too trendy. They want Alan Grant. Grant? He'll never get him out of Montana. And he says, more light. Show me something over here. Guys, give me some light. And Gennaro says, why not? While he's examining this amber, he goes, because Grant's like me. He's a digger. And then he says something like, you're a pretty one, or he says something like that to the mosquito and the amber. So in the first draft of this scene, it is astonishingly similar. I don't know really what's different here. Oh, there's a couple more details. So Donald Gennaro, here we get some description. He's 40, in a city man's idea of hiking clothes and a $100 haircut. And he approaches on a raft being pulled across the river by 2 men. That's a little different. And this we get a name for Juanito. On the hillside, Juan Rostagno. Rostagno. He's a 30-ish Costa Rican, a smart-looking guy in worker's clothes, and he's waiting for him. And then he's got 1,000 pesos, says he falls in. Gennaro finally lands, and Rostagno helps him off the raft, and he goes, Hola, Juanito. The dialogue is almost all the same. But I'll give you some of the directions here. Rostagno leads Gennaro toward the mine. Dozens of shirtless workers claw and scrape at the rocky mountainside that is the site of an extensive mining operation. The work is all done by hand, pick and shovel, instead of by dynamite and bulldozer. And then when they're having a chat here, it says a worker hurries up to them and bursts into the conversation, and he's breathless, so he's pretty excited. He says, Chief, we found another mosquito in the same place, Jeffy. And he says, are you sure? Show me. And so they scramble back deeper into the mine. Rostagno calls back over his shoulder to Gennaro. Seems like it's going to be a good day after all. They found another one. Come on. So they walk into this cave. It's dark, dripping cave where there's at least a dozen other workers, and they're all gathered in a tight circle staring at something intently. Rostagno fights his way to the center of the group, and one of the workers hands him something, and Rostagno examines it carefully. It's a chunk of amber, a shiny yellow rock about the size of a $50. And he returns and holds the amber up to the sunlight streaming through the mouth of the cave. With the light pouring through it, the amber is translucent, and we can see something inside the strange stone. A huge mosquito, long dead, entombed there. You're so beautiful. You'll make a lot of people happy, he says in Spanish. And that's it. As far as I know, Malia Scotch Marmo, her script doesn't address this section at all. These were all inventions of David Koepp. And so it skips right to Ellie and Grant working in the Badlands, which we'll cover in another episode. That's got nothing to do with us here and now. So let's review some of this. Juanito Rostagno. We don't get the name Rostagno mentioned out loud, but here's what I found about Rostagno. And should derive from the medieval name Rostagnus, according to heraldryinstitute.com. The name most likely derives from the French Rostin or Rostaine, as is also possible a direct derivation from the Germanic name Hrostein, from which the same French name is derived, consisting of the terms Hrod, H-R-O-D, which means Gloria, and Stein, which means stone, with the meaning of stone of glory. So, this name may mean stone of glory, and Juanito says, Grant is like me. He's a digger. What are they digging for? Precious rocks. Juanito mining for amber, Grant excavating for fossils. So screenwriter David Koepp couldn't possibly have stumbled across this by accident, right? He picked this name for its meaning, even though it never made it into the final product, which I think is fascinating. And Juanito is a Spanish and Hebrew name meaning, with the same etymological roots as John and Johann, things like that. It just means God is gracious. So Juanito Rostagno is looking for glorious stones by the grace of God. And if you were wondering, Gennaro, sort of an Italian word for January or Janus, where Janus is the Roman god of beginnings and transitions, hence where the word January comes from, at the beginning of the calendar year. Gennaro is also written as a fashionable dresser by Crichton, and perhaps an Italian name lends itself to Italian fashion. He meets Grant and Sattler wearing an Armani suit, which is coded as meaning, an expensive suit on page 63. Donald is sort of Scottish or Gaelic or Celtic or something like that for ruler or a great chief. But do I think that his name is meant to evoke a fashionable ruler who's rich, evoking the beginning of a new age? Not really, no. But I guess that's kind of what the name means. So the inspections. This scene introduces the need for a safety inspection, and that there is a lawsuit. This isn't quite what's being said in the novel. On page 49, Gennaro says, we can't trust Hammond anymore. He's under too much pressure. The EPA is investigating him. He's behind schedule on his Costa Rican resort, and the investors are getting nervous. There have been too many rumors of problems down there. Too many workmen have died. And now this business about a living procomsit whatever on the mainland. We're told on page 49. So there are multiple reasons, but none are said to be lawsuits. That said, nervous investors is faithful to the text. I can see why Koepp would simplify this, though. Multiple causes for concern is too busy for a quick moment of exposition, whereas a $20 million lawsuit by the family of that worker, presumably the one we just watched get eaten by a raptor, that's very simple. Further, the film strongly implies that this safety inspection will make or break Hammond, and the novel implies this too. Recall, Gennaro was firmly instructed by his boss, Daniel Ross, quote, let's be very clear about one thing. I don't know how bad that situation is, Donald, but if there's a problem on that island, burn it to the ground, we're told on page 58. And he adds, screw Hammond. But this is just the first inspection. Quote, we can't screw around with this. We've got to inspect that island right away. I've asked Hammond to arrange independent site inspections every week for the next 3 weeks, Gennaro says. Gennaro was going to be very thorough with this, and he had explicit instructions to not flinch if it came to pulling the plug. Frankly, Hammond was probably doomed before anybody arrived on the island. They were going to pull the plug on this no matter what, really. Hammond's provenance, where is he? Now, Gennaro says, we're facing a $20 million lawsuit by the family of that worker, and you're telling me Hammond can't be bothered to see me? This suggests that Hammond was down here in the Dominican Republic's amber mines? Well, but you just missed him. He just darted off to be with his daughter. Why would Hammond be in the Dominican Republic? It's no closer to Costa Rica than Boston is to Nashville. It doesn't make any sense that he would have been there. Also, Hammond isn't off visiting his daughter. We know this. Hammond darts off to Montana to bribe Grant and Sattler into joining the inspection instead. That's the next thing we see in this movie. So that he's off with his daughter is balderdash. But again, this is a fast-moving moment of exposition, so bringing up that his daughter is getting a divorce is fine. We, I guess, kind of need to know that, I guess. And that said, this is faithful to the novel. The kids' parents are getting a divorce, and it seems to be an excuse for Hammond to bring the kids to Jurassic Park. Hammond says on page 92, quote, their parents are getting a divorce. I want them to have a fun weekend here. And Timmy says his father has already moved out on page 95 and adds he moved out last month. So that would have been like July 1989. On page 34, we're told this. And that his mom has a new bald boyfriend she knows from work who's younger than his dad. He's getting the scoop on that. Now, I have a pet theory on Lex and Tim and their arrival to Jurassic Park. There's really nothing in the text that confirms this, but the clues are there that makes this something that I believe in. So the Procomsignathus remains identified by Dr. Marty Gutierrez are shipped to New York City, and Gennaro has arranged to have those remains flown to Jurassic Park. I believe that Tim and Lex live with their mom in New York City. I believe this because Tim is visiting the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Lex wears a New York Mets baseball cap. Mr. Murphy is a Mets fan, we're told over and over. And in the chapter Plans, one of the architects who designed the Isla Nublar Resort are from Dunning, Murphy and Associates, who are located in New York. Murphy is their name. These guys are from New York. They're from New York, although it's not specifically said. And finally, on page 73 in the chapter Malcolm says, I always maintained that this island would be unworkable. I predicted it from the beginning. He reached into a soft leather briefcase, and I trust by now we all know that the eventual outcome is going to be, you're going to have to shut the thing down. Shut it down, Hammond stood angrily. This is ridiculous. Then Hammond storms off to make a call. I have some phone calls to make, Hammond said, and he went into an adjoining cabin. I think this is when Hammond comes up with the scheme to have the grandkids put on the plane from New York that's already booked to transport the Compy remains to Jurassic Park. Recall, the Procomsignathus remains are intended to be shipped to Jurassic Park from New York, where Alice Levin discovered the specimen. Quote, well, I wonder if you could give me the details on that, Gennaro said. Quote, then I can run down that specimen for Mr. Hammond, who's very excited about it. I'm sure you want to see the actual specimen, too. Perhaps I can even get it delivered to the island while you're all down there, Gennaro said on page 51. And after they've arrived on the island, when Gennaro hears the helicopter arriving, he says, excuse me, but I think I hear the helicopter. That's probably the sample for Dr. Grant to look at. And he started out of the room, and they all followed on page 91. This flight from New York could have brought Lex, Tim, and the specimen. Although after Lex and Tim arrive, the specimen is forgotten. I'd like to think that the specimen that they were arranging to have delivered from New York was accompanied by Tim and Lex, and that Hammond schemed it up as Malcolm was jeopardizing his safety inspection and his plans for the future. So I just think that all fits. And Hammond admits on page 383 he should never have brought the kids. They'd been nothing but trouble from the beginning. Nobody wanted them around. Hammond had only brought them because he thought it would stop Gennaro from destroying the resort, but Gennaro was going to do it anyway. So the only argument I have to make here is that Hammond is upset that Malcolm is so matter-of-factly rejecting Jurassic Park. That he's going to deny that it's safe without ever stepping foot on the island, without inspecting a single thing. He's so prejudiced against the idea that he'll never endorse the park. This worries Hammond, and he immediately resorts to a backup plan. Get these kids here. Maybe they can have the time of their life and Gennaro won't destroy the resort. All the pieces fit together very nicely. It's just odd that there isn't any more textual connective tissues for something that I imagine Crichton so clearly thought out, but he didn't spell out. Anyhow, so that's just a pet theory of mine. Anyhow, back to our review. The site experts on page 50 were told who the site experts will be. Quote, I'm starting with the experts Hammond already hired as consultants early in the project. Gennaro tossed a list onto Ross's desk. First group is a paleontologist, a paleobotanist, and a mathematician. They go down this weekend and I'll go with them. Would they tell you the truth? Ross said. I think so. None of them had much to do with the island, and one of them, the mathematician Ian Malcolm, he was openly hostile to the project from the start. Insisted it would never work, could never work. And who else? Just a technical person, some computer systems analyst. Review the park's computers and fix some bugs. He should be there by Friday morning. That technical person is Dennis Nedry, but really, at no point does he appear to be one of the site experts that's charged with reviewing the safety of the island. This doesn't fit. Like Nedry is part of the inspection? I get that he's visiting the site at the same time, but it's tremendously incongruous with the plot that he's there as a site expert. He's on the job. He's working for Hammond. He's working out bugs. He's not there reviewing things for Gennaro's law firm. All right. Gennaro. In one script, Gennaro is introduced as Donald Gennaro, 40, in a city man's idea of hiking clothes and a $100 haircut. He approaches on a raft being pulled across a river by two men. But in the novel, Gennaro was a stocky, muscular man in his mid-30s, wearing an Armani suit and wire-frame glasses, and his secretary packed him, quote, running shoes your size, and khaki shorts and shirts, and a shaving kit, a pair of jeans and a sweatshirt if it gets cold. So Gennaro wasn't to be, dressed especially posh at the park. Ultimately, the actor, Martin Ferrero, He doesn't show up with a $100 haircut. I mean, his hair doesn't look like he gets paid, that he pays that much for a trim. A $100 haircut means he should look like he's coming straight from the red carpet, right? Or from a grand opening or something. The suit is nice, but it's not power colors, which is like dark blue. It's a fairly common tan brown. He doesn't look, out of place as perhaps it was intended to be written by the script here. And in terms of him being 40-something, or 40 or 30-something, Martin Ferrero was like 47 when the film was made, so that's fine, whatever. Finally, the script and the film posit that Grant is very content working in the Badlands, and it would be a challenge to compel him away from his work. Hammond was able to convince Grant over the telephone. On page 48, I'd like you to look at the island for me. Give me your opinion. I'll be paying you the usual weekend consultant rate of $20,000 a day. That'd be $60,000 for 3 days, and if you can spare Dr. Sattler, she'll go at the same rate. We need a botanist. What do you say? Elliot looked at Grant as he said, well, Mr. Hammond, that much money would fully finance our expeditions for the next 2 summers. I guess we can, they say. So the cash spoke to them. That's all there was to it. Hammond on that call was actually distracted by the Procomsignathus remains. So he didn't really have to twist their arm. He didn't even give his full attention. So they were purchased pretty quick for heroes. All right, that is it. Special thank you to Dr. Mark A. Loewen for joining the show. Thank you so much, Mark. That was incredible. And I want to sign off today thanking you for joining me. If you'd like to read along in the book, add some thoughts to what we've been discussing on the show, or be a guest on the show and chat with me about anything you like about Jurassic Park, you can do that by connecting with me. I'm at ryansrogers@gmail.com. And if you'd like to be a guest, drop me a line. We can try and set something up. We can rehash, tear down, gush over, and chit-chat about any part of the book, or also not the book. All you'd like. Jurassic Park-Cast is part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, the Infantry, Horse of them all, the King Street Capers. And you can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting the schickens.blogspot.com, finding us on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, or I'm on YouTube by searching Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, or on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, and I'm on X, RogersRyan22. Thank you dearly for tuning into the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast where we talk about the novel Jurassic Park, and also not that too. Until next time.